Okay, and I will get the presentation up. One moment. How does that look? Is that full screen?
Yeah, it's full screen, Rebecca. You just need to press present.
There's no present button.
I'll pop in.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Oh, weird.
Sorry, folks. One sec. Let me reshare here.
Let me press refresh. Oh, I've never seen that page. Press the three little dots there, or the those. Strange. It's a Google document, doesn't it?
I'll just mute myself for 1 second. Sorry, folks. Sorry, folks. This is what it's going to look like. I hope that's all right. There's no full screen button. I'll turn it over to you, Sakura.
Okay. Okay, so for this tour, I think everyone got the map a couple days beforehand, and just because we can't have both of the screens open, I'm going to try my best to describe whereabouts we are about on the map along Carnegie Street. And if you want to have your map open to follow along, that will also be great. Okay, so let's see, and then with this tour, I would like to go to the next page where we describe who this might be named after, and it's named after Henry Howard Molyneux Herbert, who was also the 4th Earl of Carnarvon. He was a British politician and was a member of the Conservative Party, and in Canada he was also the Secretary of the State of the Colonies twice, one first term between 1866 to 1867, then again in 1874 to 1878. And while he was the Secretary of State of the Colonies, in 1867, he contributed to Canada by supervising the drafts of the British North American Act in 1867, which then led to the Confederation and making of the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And then in 1874, he proposed the Carnarvon terms, which was supposed to resolve conflicts between BC and Canada regarding how to have the Canadian Pacific Railway cross all across Canada. Okay. So that's who it is named, who Carnarvon Street is named after. And then I would like to start with the very first building that we would have started off with. We were at the actual location, the Holy Trinity Romanian Orthodox Church, located at 220 Carnarvon Street. And we're going to walk down the street towards New Westminster SkyTrain station from this point. And to start off, this church was built in 1924, and it was originally the Norwegian Lutheran Church, and built in 1924, but services were held in the basement for them until the whole construction of the church was completed in 1935. And they continued their service at this location until they sold the church to the French Catholics in 1958 or 1960s. And the Lutherans moved to a new location at that time to 930 Cumberland Street. Then the French Catholics were there for about 2 decades until they sold the place to the Korean Catholic Church next. And then from around 2006, I believe, not sure about the exact years, it was since then been the home of the Holy Trinity Romanian Orthodox Church. And let's see. I wonder if, Juana, have you been to this church before, I wonder?
Yes, I have been many times. If visitors walk by, they have a really interesting carved wooden gate and a traditional style cross on the outside. If you do get to visit inside, it's all painted Orthodox style.
Interesting. I've never had the experience of going inside yet, so that was really nice to know. Thank you. Then on to the next building, which would be on our right side if we were actually walking down. It would be the Maria Curie Cottage. And just as a background, her husband, James Curie, was a royal engineer, also known as the Sappers, who took part in creating New Westminster. And while the Sappers, they did build New Westminster, a good number of them, the regiment, went back to Britain after a while, but they stayed in New Westminster and ran a hotel called the Telegraph House. Then years went by and James Curie died due to an accident, and Maria was suddenly responsible for taking care of herself and her 3 children alone. And so to do this, in 1887, she bought some land and created 2 cottages to run as rental properties. And that's the photo of Maria Curie just on the right. Then on the next page, I have a photo of the actual building just right here. So with her boarding home, this was a success at the time, just because the Canadian Pacific Railway was coming to New Westminster, but there weren't enough homes for the sudden growth in the community. So that helped. And with the success of her boarding home at the time, she was able to send all her children to the city's Catholic schools. And in 2009, she had 2 cottages, and they were merged into the 2 buildings were merged in 2009. And this is significant in a sense. Her home is significant to our history and just how New Westminster in general right now, because it's a rare case of using heritage revitalization agreement such that in keeping the heritage home alive right now, it's also used to assist men who are at risk of homelessness, and we don't have too much examples of this happening where heritage homes are making social contributions, and the Maria Curie Cottage is a great example of one. And so this is a photograph from just Google Street Views very recently. So if you can go see her place, it would still be looking just as is right now. And then if still looking on the right side of the street. As we walk down, we would come across to a different church called the Emmanuel Pentecostal Church. And this building, originally it was the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and it was a wooden building. And that wooden building would be viewable on the right side, also wooden right now. And this was one of the first Presbyterian church built in mainland BC. And on the left side of the building, the red brick building, it was built between 1888 to 1891. And it's visible on the left side of this photograph, I'm sorry. And there are some steeples shown on the left side of the tower, but these were, if we go to the next photograph, yes. So this is a photograph from right now, and the steeples aren't there anymore. They were removed in 1930 when the church underwent some repairs. And because this church was built between 1888 to 1891, it was there during the Great Fire of 1898, but luckily this one did survive. And it was also the location for a memorial dedication in 1998, which occurred as a 100th year anniversary for the 1898 Great Fire. Was there anything you wanted to add, Juana, or should I move on? Or?
Yep, you can move on. The only thing I was going to say is because this church was right at the edge of the fire, I think they were hosting a lot of the people who had lost their homes. And I've met somebody from a few years ago at the Presbyterian Church. Today, they're in another location of New West. They said for that time, it was very unusual because the different Christian churches didn't often cooperate. So that was kind of a unique thing for them to do.
Okay. That's interesting to know. Okay, thank you. Then still on the same street, on the same side, the right side still, this will be the Carnarvon Court. Okay, so this apartment was built in 1927 by Isaac Morrow at a cost of $30,000 or $35,000. The costs were a little different depending on which newspaper I was looking at. And just before I tell about a couple of a fire that happened at this place, I want to note that this land was originally owned by Judge Begbie, which we will talk about later on. And prior to an apartment being built here, there was a home built by Dr. Charles Joseph Fagan, and he bought 4 lots of land from Judge Begbie and built a home at $5,500 at this location, and it was there until he moved out of New West, and Isaac Moore eventually built a different apartment here. And I don't know, some of you may have read this story already on the Daily Living Guide, but there was a fire in March of 1928 at this apartment, just a couple months after the apartment was built. The apartment was built in August of the previous year, in such that around 5 p.m., someone threw an inflammable substance down the garbage chute located at the center of the building. And at the time, there were 10 suites being used, and all the tenants were evacuated safely, but all suites were damaged by smoke and water. Damaged were estimated to have exceeded $5,000 at the time. Luckily, they did have insurance. However, that is a lot that had to be covered. And the fire was so bad that it took firefighters about 1 hour to just take the blaze out. And I was not able to find whether they were able to determine who lit the fire at the time, but would anyone from the museum actually have answers to whether there was, whether they were able to pinpoint who started the fire?
Yeah, I can't remember for
Is
that
it-
one.
Yes, I wasn't able to find any articles on who may have started the fire, but I did find that there were no one died or got injured from this fire. Okay, then moving on to the next block, we would walk a little distance and looking to the left this time, there is the Holy Trinity Cathedral. And this photograph, it's actually the photograph of the church after it was rebuilt after the Great Fire in 1898, not the original church. So the original church, it was a log building built in 1860, and it was consecrated by Bishop Hill on December 2nd of the same year. And 1865, the wooden church was burnt down and only the wooden bell tower was left of the original building. But sadly, that bell tower also had to be demolished in 1880 after being determined it was unsafe to have it there. Then after the log building was burnt down, they rebuilt the church with stone in 1867. But sadly, this building, unlike the Emmanuel Pentecostal Church, which survived the Great Fire, this one was destroyed again in the fire. And on the next slide, I have an image of how the church looked like after the fire. It looked, the church, even though it was made from stone, because it was made from stone, the exteriors were preserved, but as we can see, the vast majority of the building was destroyed. And in comparison to the previous photograph, which you can see that shape from Clarkson Street rather than Carnarvon Street, this photograph of the destroyed church, it would be a view from Carnarvon Street. And so the church from the previous slide, it was rebuilt between 1898 to 1902. And this will be the church we would have been able to see if we were walking down the street today. Being very nice olive color. I do recommend people to go check this church out on a much nicer day, maybe not a day when it's raining like today. Then right beside the church, as we walk down, still on the left side of the block, would be Shelly's hair studio. And this is also a pretty old home. Sadly, not the original, as the original was burnt down during the fire, just like the church. So the original home, it was owned by the Davidsons, who owned a harness and saddlery shop at Front Street. And though sadly their home burnt down, their shop on Front Street actually survived the fire. But if there were any damages done, it seemed like the shop wasn't insured. So not sure if that was good or bad, but their business did survive the fire. And they lived at the Davidsons lived at this location from around 1890s to 1930s that I was able to find of. And couple more people owned the home until at about 1980, when it became the location of Don Elliott Photography. And he was actually the grandson of a Vancouver photographer, Frank Gowen, who also has a book about himself. And I wondered if anyone actually has read the book or have been to the Don Elliott Photography. Did you have anything to add, Juana? If not,
Yep, you can go ahead.
Okay, for sure. Okay, then as we go down, this will be at the corner of the block, so still on the left side for this building, be at 49 6th Street. This one was built after the fire in 1908, and it says that at around 1925, it was owned, but it was a grocery store called Iwo and owned by Johnny Chung. He, a well-known Chinese businessman, and he came to Canada in around 1921, and it seems like the grocery store stayed at this location for a good couple of years until maybe relocating to Columbia Street at 739 Columbia Street. And for the vast majority of the time, and after that, it seems like cleaners and dyers were there, known as Elite Cleaners and Dyers. I think I have a photograph of them on the next slide. So I wasn't really too sure about when they moved to the specific corner, as this photograph, as you can see, it said that they were actually located on 47th 6th Street, but as I looked through the directories and newspapers, they moved between 47th to 45, then to 49 in 1934, but the local newspapers had their addresses written as 49 6th Street from 1925, when the grocery store was still there, but eventually they did move to 49 6th Street. And this location, as I sifted through the newspapers, found that they had a lot of burglary events during 1940 to the 1950s, and on many, at least, so they had at least 5 of them during the decade or so, and each of the time they would have $150 worth, $300, $900 worth of suits stolen at the time. And if my conversions were correct, because the one incident in around during the early 1940s, when they had $150 worth of suits stolen, if the conversion was correct, it would be around worth $2,000 at this time, which was pretty shocking. And out of the 5 cases, it said at least 2 of them were committed by youth, which was a little concerning. But, and what else? Aside from having burglaries of their own, they've also had an incident in 1957 where there was a Dairyland manager who was robbed in front of the bank at 511 Columbia Street, which would be the location I believe right across the old Army and Navy location. He was robbed there at gunpoint, and then a jeweler took his gun out and followed the robber, chased him into this exact location, and then the police also chased after him to this location. And looking at that, I was surprised on the amount of burglaries and crime going on in this neighborhood. But let's see. Would anyone have anything to add about this specific lot? Or may I move on?
You can go ahead and move on. I will change the slide.
Okay, for sure. Then I'll be moving on to the next block. And so we're still looking on our left side. And I don't have too much to say about this building other than it was built in 1906 at a cost of $14,000. And it was used as the Federal Fisheries and Indian Affairs Office until the early 1990s, so good few decades. And at the time, so the main floor was used as the Indian Affairs Office, and the second floor belonged to the Fisheries Department. That's about all I have for this. If anyone has anything to add on, please do. I'll be happy to hear.
There are a few questions. Do you want to leave them until the end, or do you want to visit a few of them?
I can visit a few of them while it's fresh in our memories. Yes.
Sure. I'll start from the beginning, just before we move on to this block. So the first question was, what is the difference between Catholic and Pentecostal, and why don't they cooperate?
Juana, would you happen to know what answer to this? I would actually love to know the difference, as well. I'm not too knowledgeable in religion, so.
I'm not too knowledgeable either. We did an exhibit with the Presbyterian Church in 2012 because they had donated an altar from that really early church. And for their 150th anniversary, they wanted to have it on display. So we worked with them to record a little bit of the history and have it in the old building behind Irving House where the museum used to be. From what I gather at the time, I don't know what the difference is between all the different Christian churches, but from what I gather is that everybody did have a lot of loyalty to theirs. I'm not sure if somebody in the audience later can knows more stuff if they have more knowledge about that. But good question.
The next, oh.
No, I was just gonna say it would be definitely something for me to look into later. Yes.
Okay, yeah, we do have one person who says, I may know. Vanessa, you're welcome to contribute an answer if you do. While we're waiting on that, I will go on to the next question. It says, how did Judge Begbie acquire his land?
With that, I don't have too much details, but would you have something to add other than he was the Chief Justice?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I don't know much about that. All I know is that he had that piece of land, and in the early colonial years, when he had to come to the mainland, he would live in New West. But I don't know where his house was exactly, aside from that general lot. I don't know how he acquired his land. I know there was some controversy with mines that he had, but I think there was no controversy around this that I know of.
Yeah, I might actually be able to get back to you on that question. I've come across some stuff in my own research, but I don't know it off the top of my head. But yeah, he was one of the first private property owners in New Westminster because of his position. Here's a math question for you. What would $5,000 be in today's money?
$5,000, that's a good question. Maybe I'll just I'll have
Take to Google.
$5,000. Let me convert right now.
Sure. While you're doing that, we have another comment from Vanessa. So different countries had different versions of Christianity. Scottish Presbyterian is one example. And yeah, I think that was in relation to the religious question that came up. We'll all be taking to Google after this.
Okay. And I'm just almost there. Let's see. Was there a specific year for the $5,000 which might be useful to know? But let's see.
We can look that one up after. The ones where we need Google. Maybe we'll continue with the presentation, and then we can revisit some of these other questions.
Okay, for sure.
Okay, so I will go to the next slide.
And okay, just a quick note on the conversion. I just did one through the Bank of Canada right now, and if it's for 1920, it would have been worth $5,000 would be worth about 60,000 today money.
Thank you for doing that.
Over 10 times the value. Wow. Okay, then moving on to the Begbie Square, which would require us to look on the right side of the street right now. So a little ways up. So this we right across the Begbie, almost right across the Histories building we were just talking about. So this we don't have the statue up there anymore, as some of you may know, but there used to be a statue of Matthew Bailey Begbie, who was the Chief Justice of British Columbia from 1871 to 1894. He was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1875 for his work in BC, and his statue was installed at the location in 1891. And just as some back notes, at the time, he was known to be able to speak the Shuswap language and the Chilcotin language fluently, and he also had Indigenous people relying on him and also doing translations for them for some cases when needed. And although there was an incident in 1864 during the Chilcotin War, which was ultimately the reason why the statue was removed in 2019. He sentenced 6 Chilcotin chiefs to the death penalty in 1864 during the Chilcotin War, and these wrongful hangings, the apologies for them were made by Christy Clark in 2014 and also by Justin Trudeau in 2018. And what I'm still learning and is a little confused about is that although he did make these sentences, it's also recorded that during the 1870s, he took part to persuading the federal government in preserving Indigenous people's rights to fish on the Lower Fraser. So I'm a little confused I'm still learning about his stance of where he was and what his relations were with the Indigenous people. However, the statue was removed in 2018 for the wrongful decisions. And Rebecca, would you have anything to add about him? Or Rebecca, anyone?
Yeah, there's lots that I could add about him. I might try to look up some resources and some information that has come out through the city that we can encourage everyone to sort of read into themselves. That might be the best way to go about that.
Okay. then on to the Carnegie Library, and this library not present anymore, but so this library could have been located at 705 Carnarvon Street, or the present location of Begbie Square, which we just talked about. And so Carnegie Library, the first cornerstone was placed during a Masonic ceremony in 1902, and the library was built after negotiations between Mr. Carnegie and the City of New Westminster, that if the City of New Westminster supports a free library at a cost of $1,500 per year in 1902, at a suitable site, he would furnish $15,000 to build a new library. And so they came to agreement and the new library was built. And it took 2 years for the construction to be completed. And at the time, Vancouver newspapers had it advertised as a pretty and convenient structures, but it was demolished in 1960 after the library moved to its current location along 6th Street in 1958. So 2 years after the library moving, the whole building was demolished. Then, let's see. Then we would also continue walking down this, or in a similar area. This would be Begbie Court. It would actually be right across Begbie Square. It's a red brick building, easy to find. And so with the photographs, the left one would be the view from Carnarvon Street, and the black and white photo on the right would be the view from Clarkson Street. And so this was Chief Justice Begbie's workplace, and the exteriors, as you might be able to see in the photos, but much more noticeable if you're able to see it in person. It's built using bricks and stones, and for that reason, the exteriors survived the 1898 fire, the fire we've been mentioning so often. But because the interiors were made of wood, the insides were completely destroyed, as we can see on the next photographs. Let's see. Yes, please, thank you. So in this photograph, we can see that a part of the building is fenced off right after. So after the fire, and the building, the courthouse was rebuilt by G.W. Grant, who also built the original building in 1891. I might have had the year wrong at the bottom of this, may have, but that's about all I have for this building. Then moving down, so we'll be walking down Carnarvon, looking on the left and going a little bit downhills along Begbie Street, and we would be able to see Arundel Mansions at 48 Begbie Street. And this building, we have a video we might be able to show later of people doing a tour of this now hotel. And to start off, so this building was built in 1912 at a cost of $100,000. And it was also owned by the individual who owned the Russell's Hotel, which would be a little ways up Begbie Street, and which we will be talking about later. And at the time when it was built, it was described as being the ideal family apartment house, because ideal family apartment house for upscale families, as the mansion was close to the BC Electric Railway station, which meant it be really convenient for people there to travel, similar to how we have the newest SkyTrain station close to this region. And but at the same time, it was also home to people who worked at the riverfronts, loggers, fishermen, prospectors, and people who worked for the railway, just because of how it is so close to the quay, as some people might be familiar with. And as I mentioned before, it's a hotel right now, so I think people can stay at this place if they want to. Mona, have you ever been to the hotel before? Or?
No, I have not. There are quite a few videos on YouTube that people can check of people who film their stays. It is quite unique, and we will provide a link if people want to watch one of these videos. If people, I'm not sure if it's still online. We did write a time traveler column about the Russell Hotel, the neighboring building that I think you're going to talk about next, Sakura.
Yes.
And that, yeah, that article was, I believe, at the end of 2019. And it's at the back of the Active Living Guide. We write a column 4 times a year about local history.
This is definitely something to check out. Okay, then I will talk about the Russell's Hotel that we were just mentioning. So this was built in 1908. And so as I looked through the newspapers, I found that from between 1940s and 1950s, their softball team, they had a softball team, which was mentioned fairly frequently and did take quite a bit of space on local newspapers. Then it was renamed the College Place Hotel in 1974 with a bar named Jugs and Mugs right on the ground level. And then since 2008, it has been occupied by the Lookout Housing and Health Society. And a couple of stories to add is that I was surprised on how there were a couple more robbery stories from this location as well, in addition to the 49th 6th Street location, in such that in 1925, $77 were stolen from the till as a clerk helped a sobbing woman upstairs to a room where she claimed her husband was meeting another man and a woman. And for that time, $77 would be worth around $900 today. Then in 1960s, so just about a decade before it was renamed the College Place Hotel, there were 2 teenagers armed with pistols who robbed $110 from the hotel desk clerk. And at this time, the clerk ended up being handcuffed and blindfolded, which is something I do not see on the news too often today. Let's see. And those are the 2 stories I have for this hotel, but would anyone have anything to add, or may I move on?
Go ahead.
Okay. So moving down, so we'll be looking on our right side of the street now, but this will be right across where Russell's Hotel would have been. So this is at 759 Carnarvon Street. This red building was built in 1947, and it was a dance hall called the Hollywood Bowl until the 1960s. And during this time, and maybe into the time when it was also a cabaret and restaurant, and which would have been between 1964 to 1968, there were many newspaper articles stating there were people getting into fights, conflicts with the the police in this region, just this area right outside of the restaurant, in such that in 1952, there was a near riot-like incident with about 300 people involved and were just getting in trouble with the police. And in 1960, there was an incident where a few teenagers got fined for possession of alcohol while they were on the way to the dance hall as a post-graduation celebration. And when I saw this article, this is when I learned dry grad maybe had a reason, just because when I had dry grad during my high school years, I was not exactly sure why we had it, since both prom and dry grads were relatively dry. And then moving back to the story of this building, in 1986, it became a restaurant, and currently it serves as a banquet hall. And then if we move a couple meters down, still looking to the right, it would be the old IOF building, which stands for Independent Order of Odd Fellows. And they were a secret society founded in the 18th century and in England. And they established in North America at around 1819. But this building was built in 1887. And if we go on to the next one, I have a zoomed in picture of one of their symbols, the 3 chains, which represent friendship, love, and truth. And this building was built by Charles Henry Clow, which was also a member of the IOF. And just as a side note, he also was the architect who handled designing building, the Maria Curie Cottage, as well as the Royal Columbian Hospital we have. And this building also went through a couple of fires. It burnt down once in 1891, and it was rebuilt by Clow. And then during the Great Fire, 1898, it was again burnt down, and it was also rebuilt by Clow again. Then after it stopped being used as the IOF building in 1946, this served as the Army, Navy, and Air Force's Veterans Hall. And then following that, for the last couple decades, it has been used as a restaurant, as well as a few salons recently. And then for our last stop, so this would be pointing towards where our current Westminster SkyTrain station is located. It would have been the location of a Chinatown, which used to exist in New Westminster as well. So as a backstory, the first Chinatown formed in New West at around 1860. Okay. 1860s due to the gold rush, and there were people coming from China as well as California for this. But this first Chinatown formed along Front Street, and then the second Chinatown would have been where we would have been located, where we would be looking at towards the SkyTrain station, which was known as the Swamp, as it was a flood-prone region. But most of the buildings in that region were owned by wealthy Chinese merchants. And sadly, both of these Chinatowns were destroyed in the 1898 Great Fire. And even though the vast majority of the Chinatowns were destroyed at this time, a few years later, in 1919, the provincial fire marshal ordered the rest of the Chinatown buildings to be demolished, as they were deemed as being potential fire traps. So all the buildings gone. But even just a little bit before he ordered all the buildings to be demolished, there was a little bit of rebuilding of the community in this region, such that there was a Chinese Freemason Hall created near Carnarvon and McInnes. And also in 1919, during the Prohibition, there's a story that Sankowo Company, which used to be located along Carnarvon, they were charged with illegal importation of 177 cases of liquor disguised as nut oil at that time. Okay, and that's all I have for the Chinatown along Carnarvon Street, but would there be anything anyone would like to add?
I was just going to say thank you, Sakura. There's a really rich history of that area, quite a bit more than we can get into right now in the next few minutes. But some of the interesting businesses, or rather the most interesting one I could find, was there in about 1906, 1907, there was a restaurant owned by a young woman who grew up here, Lizzie Chan, and the newspapers of the time, even though they were often quite racist, the English newspapers, they really talked highly about this woman and her restaurant. But I think right now it is 7 o'clock, so I'm kind of curious if we have any more questions.
I've just stopped the screen share just so we can see each other.
Okay.
I'll look back up here to see what questions we missed. Sorry. Let's see here. Just have to scroll up. So, okay. Any ideas about why there was so much crime? I'm assuming that was, you had mentioned it was on a specific block?
Yes, the 49 6th Street block, I found there were quite a lot more crime going on there than I imagined, as well as just the block close to Russell's Hotel and the Metro. There were quite a bit of articles on it. Not exactly sure why, but for 49 6th Street, I wonder if it was just an easy target just because they are on a corner of the block. And yeah, and just maybe it was just easy to enter for that location, not sure. Not sure if that's also the reason why the businesses around there change so frequently right now. That's just a question I have, but with the area close to Russell's Hotel and the Metro, I'm curious as to if it was just because there was all these sources for liquor bars that people weren't able to control themselves as well at the time. I'm not sure, but Mona, would you be familiar with why there might have been so much crime? Or Rebecca? I'm not sure. I also used to hear that when I was younger, New Westminster, it wasn't the safe. Some of the streets weren't the safest place to be. So I wonder if it was just if that was an extension of the history behind, but I'm not sure why there were exactly so many crimes back then.
I think it's a couple of things. The newspapers, of course, reported on what was exciting, and crime made the news. You are also correct with pointing out the alcohol. New Westminster it's either in BC or in Western Canada, had the highest number of bar seats per capita. So this was, the city was very hard drinking, despite the restrictions that came later with the prohibition. And even after the prohibition, the rules were quite strict. So that could be part of it.
Yeah, and considering that even in the Chinatown, I was able to find that case where they had 177 cases of liquor during the prohibition. I won't be surprised if other businesses around there were also able to sneak a little bit in to enjoy. Maybe that was a factor.
I've just put in my email to the chat. If anyone has any questions, just because I'm seeing that it is 7:03, any questions for Sakura or for myself or for Juana, we're happy to take them after the program as well. I think I saw all of the questions. I might have missed a couple, but are there any others before we sort of part for the evening? I think that's it. Okay, well, I don't want to. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, can I just add? Yeah, I would just like to add that though this tour had to be virtual, if on a sunny day, I would really recommend people to walk down this quiet street. It's a really nice walk. And all these old buildings are still there, even though they may have been repainted recently. So yes. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. You can take your map and your notes, hopefully, that you've taken. I want to say thank you very much to Sakura for that presentation, for all the information you managed to fit into an hour, and also to Juana for adding and sprinkling in a little bit more information as well. So thanks to everyone. Thanks for all of the questions. And again, feel free to reach out if you're curious about anything else. Okay. We'll end it there. Good night, everybody.